Dr. Helfand just told me that he's going to do a little bit different. Since there's so many committed people, it sounds like we're all really committed to this issue that are here tonight. And he'll speak and then maybe do a planning session strategizing about what to do about all this, more than he would in his normal speech. And if you want, if you like what you heard here tonight, we have another event that he's coming to in October 22nd at the Durham Library. So we've already got commitments from 2 of the town council members to be at that event. So, which is good in terms of getting back to the brink kind of things going on. That'll all be explained as we get started here, but maybe you want to pass those around. Okay, so I'm Sandra Yardy. I'm on the planning committee for Seacoast Peace Response. And of course, this has been one of our issues since our inception back in 2002, 2001. I wasn't in the organization then, but just nuclear non-proliferation. So Ira works with the Physicians for Social Responsibility. He has published papers on the medical consequences of nuclear war. He has talked before the United Nations General Assembly. He's represented the Physicians for Social Responsibility at the Nobel ceremony when President Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize. He's also on the steering committee of ICAN, International Committee for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. And you went to another, did you also go to? And they received the Nobel Peace Prize, and you got to go that. Okay, you might want to say something about that. That's really pretty exciting. And he's lectured throughout the world, and we're so incredibly fortunate to have him here with us tonight.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Okay.
I'm really very, very happy to be in Hampshire. I was born here, in Manchester. And my mom's family is from Manchester and Concord. But the real reason I'm happy to be here is not for that. It's because New Hampshire, as everybody knows, plays this huge outsized role in shaping the debate, the terms of debate for the presidential election. And along with Iowa, it's the 2 places where there's really retail politics. And there's a real chance for us to get into this debate and affect what people are talking about. The basic thing that I'm trying to do in the PSR, or the Back on the Brink campaign, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, is trying to do, is to make the urgent need to eliminate nuclear weapons a topic of conversation in the next election. And to make sure, if possible, that the administration which takes office in January of 2021, and it will be a different administration, that administration is truly committed to the elimination of nuclear weapons, not at a rhetorical level, as Obama appears to have been, but at a real policy level. The new president coming in sees this, as we do, as the most urgent strategic security, imperative for U.S. policy, and staffs the administration, the Defense Department, State Department, and the Department of Energy, and the National Security Council, with people who share that vision, not people who are planning to sabotage efforts to get rid of these weapons. So the moment that we're in is conditioned, I think, by 2 things. On the one hand, there is an extraordinary increase in the danger that we face. And on the other hand, the general public and the media and the political elites, the leaders in Washington, are just ignoring this to a significant degree. And then on the third hand, there is, however, a movement amongst ordinary people to try to, again, bring this to the fore. So let me start by talking a little bit about the danger, because I think it is important to understand how dangerous the current moment is. We, in the 25 years since the end of the Cold War, have all of us, those of us who were active at that time, gotten used to the notion that things aren't really quite as desperate as they used to be, and that we don't really need to focus on this as much as we used to. And that actually may have been true to some degree during the 90s and the early 2000s, but it's not true anymore. And when William Perry says, as he does repeatedly, that the situation today is closer to nuclear war than it has ever been, including at the worst moment of the Cold War, I think we need to listen to that. And we need to make sure that we get that message out to other people. looking at this, I've identified 7 reasons why I think the situation is more dangerous, which I'll go through with you quickly. 4 that relate to geopolitical situations, and then there are 3 other issues that we need to worry about. On the geopolitical scale, the first and foremost is U.S.-Russian relations. They're at the worst point they've been at in 25, 27 years. And we were told during all this time that we didn't need to worry about this, that there was never going to be a war between the United States and Russia. They weren't enemies anymore. I remember a conversation I had at the State Department with Rose Gottemoeller in 2014, just 4 years ago, where we were there to talk to her about the ban treaty. And she said, the United States does not even consider the possibility of war with Russia. We don't plan for it. All we're worried about is terrorists. And I said, that's kind of short-sighted. This really is still an issue. Well, obviously, since then, at that point, the war in Syria was already a big issue. The Ukraine situation was already a big issue. These things have become much worse since then. And it's clear that by accident or by design, the U.S. and Russia could stumble into a war in any one of several places. And if that were to happen, current Russian military doctrine calls for the early use of nuclear weapons because they feel that they're outgunned in terms of conventional forces. It mirrors the doctrine that the U.S. and NATO had in the 1980s when we planned to use nuclear weapons early on because we felt outgunned in conventional forces. So that is, I think, the most important of the geopolitical concerns, but it's only one of several. U.S.-China relations, the worst they've been at in 30 years, 40 years, actually. During the 1980s, China was practically an honorary member of NATO, in the final confrontation with the Soviet Union. And that clearly is not the case anymore. The United States and China have an increasingly tense and hostile relationship, exacerbated by certain personalities in Washington, we'll talk about later. But inherently, this relationship has become more adversarial. And there's a military dimension to that too. U.S. and Chinese naval forces have these games of chicken in the South China Sea on a regular basis. It is not far-fetched to imagine something going wrong during one of these games of chicken, as often happens when people play chicken. And that something going wrong could escalate to nuclear war very quickly. The third geopolitical flashpoint is North Korea, the one that's achieved the most breakthrough in terms of people's awareness of it this year. And I think we have to understand that earlier this year we really dodged a bullet in Korea. But I don't think that bullet stopped ricocheting around, and I'm not sure that we really dodged it completely. At the moment, the rhetoric is tamped down, but nothing fundamental has changed. The North Koreans still have a nuclear arsenal. And at some point, when Donald Trump understands how badly he's been had by the North Korean leadership, and I think he has been had, we don't know how he's going to react. He may just continue to try lying about all the great progress he made and what a great victory this was, or he may be forced to acknowledge the fact that they didn't get rid of nuclear weapons and then revert back to the very confrontational posture that he had adopted earlier in the year. The fourth geopolitical flashpoint is one which I think is as dangerous, and it gets no attention here in the States at all, and that's South Asia. India and Pakistan now have about 130 nuclear warheads each. They have fought 4 wars. There's fighting every single day on the border that divides them in Kashmir. The water crisis, which lies at the heart of the conflict in many ways, is getting worse and worse. And no one who follows stuff there closely would be surprised to wake up tomorrow morning and see that the fighting in Kashmir had escalated, or that some terrorist group based in Pakistan had carried out another attack like the ones that took place at the Indian Parliament or in Mumbai in 2008, and that this has now escalated into conflict. And again, as is the case with NATO-Russia potential conflict, a conflict in South Asia will go nuclear very quickly. The Indians have great tactical superiority over the Pakistanis. In response to that, the Pakistanis have evolved a military doctrine which calls for the early use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, and the Indians have responded with the nuclear doctrine, all this in the published literature, that if the Pakistanis use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, they will attack Pakistani cities with strategic nuclear weapons. It's an extraordinarily dangerous situation, and one which gets almost no attention. 3 other factors we need to worry about. First, climate change. Not necessarily an obvious connection, but it is making the world much more dangerous, and it is making the chance of nuclear war much greater. The US and the other nuclear weapon states often say they are willing to get rid of their nuclear weapons someday, but the time isn't right. In the future, when things are more secure, then they'll do it. The world's not getting more secure, and climate change is the main reason for that. As large areas of the planet become less and less able to support their current populations, let alone the increase in population that we're anticipating over the next few decades, there's going to be increased potential for conflict as people start fighting over increasingly scarce resources. And if nuclear weapons are on the table, they're going to get used. This is particularly a factor in South Asia. As the Indus River dries up, the waters of the Indus are essential for several hundred million people living on both sides of the India-Pakistan border. They're going to start fighting over who gets the water. And as I was just saying, that fight will become a nuclear war. In the Middle East, much of what drives the conflict, I mean, there are obviously complicated political and religious dimensions to the problems in the Middle East, but much of what is really driving things now are water shortages. They're going to get worse, and the potential there for conflict, probably not nuclear today if it were to happen, but Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, they're all flirting with the idea of building nuclear weapons. And so as time goes by, it's going to get more dangerous there also. The three non-geopolitical factors, the non-geopolitical factors that I think is sort of one that doesn't get very much attention is cyber terrorism. We used to think that the worst thing we had to worry about in terms of terrorism was that terrorists would get hold of a nuclear bomb or maybe some fissile material and make their own, probably small, Hiroshima-sized bomb and blow it up in New York or in Washington or in Tel Aviv or Moscow. What we are now told is that what we really need to worry about is the possibility that terrorists will carry out a cyber attack and hack into the command and control systems of the United States or Russia and either directly launch the nuclear missiles of the country they're attacking or create the impression in the country that's being hacked that it is under nuclear attack from some outside enemy, prompting them to launch their missiles. This is a real nightmare scenario because no one really knows what to do about this. I mean, there's a huge cybersecurity industry that tries to protect against these kinds of intrusions, but we know that the Pentagon computers get hacked into many, many times every day, and the possibility that they could, at some point, that attackers could get into the command and control system for the nuclear arsenal is real, and it gives nightmares to people who watch this. The final factor that I think is increasing danger of nuclear war today is the Trump presidency. And it's the one that I feel most uncomfortable talking about because I do not think that this whole conversation should be couched in partisan terms. But I also don't think the criticism of Trump is a partisan criticism. It comes primarily from security experts in his own party. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to remind people of that. During the election, I think it was close to 100 Republican national security experts signed a statement saying that the president lacked the judgment, the temperament, and the knowledge base to command a nuclear arsenal. Since he has come into office, it is reported credibly that his former Secretary of State is called a moron, that his current Secretary of Defense is called an idiot, and that others in his administration refer to him as the fifth grader. This is not normal, and it is very, very dangerous. We have said in the United States for decades that it would be impermissible for a single nuclear weapon to fall into the wrong hands, by which we meant a terrorist group or a rogue state. We've turned 6,800 nuclear warheads over to Donald Trump, and there are implications of that fact. And we need to appreciate how extraordinarily dangerous this moment is. The full extent of his psychological issues and his personal instability is not known. But everything that we can see from his public statements and his public behavior is very, very disturbing. No one with this kind of personality structure should ever be in charge of a nuclear arsenal. I mean, I would argue that no one ever should be in charge under any circumstances because we all make mistakes. But we certainly should not allow a situation with somebody with this kind of behavior, public behavior, to be in this position. So for those 7 reasons, and perhaps the 8th factor is that it's not being paid attention to. that the vast majority of our fellow citizens are really not aware of this danger. Back in the 1980s, if you ask people what are the major problems in the world today, number one or number two on everybody's list was preventing nuclear war. If you ask people today, they'll all say we should get rid of the weapons, they're bad, they're dangerous, nuclear war would be horrible. But nobody thinks it's an issue. It's not on the top 10 or top 15 list of the vast majority of people. And until we change that, we're not going to get change in policy. It's not going to come from the top. We may have a Gorbachev figure emerge who really gets it and is determined to change U.S. policy. But my guess is that it's not going to happen unless there's also, at the very least, permission from the general public, if not an outright demand from the general public, that we make this change in our policy. So let me talk for a few minutes about the message that PSR feels is our particular contribution, which is what happens if nuclear weapons get used. Because that's the other thing people need to understand. They need to know that nuclear war really can happen. And they need to know how horrible it's going to be if nuclear war does happen. And here the news is also very bad. It's not that things have changed, it's just that our understanding has changed. We used to think that we only really had to worry about the US-Russian nuclear conflict in terms of threat to the planet as a whole. What we've learned in the last decade is that even a very limited nuclear war, as might take place between smaller nuclear powers like India and Pakistan, would be a threat to the entire planet. The scenario that's been looked at repeatedly now involves a war between India and Pakistan in which each of these countries uses 50 Hiroshima-sized bombs against urban targets in the other country. And when this scenario was first published, I think it was in 2006, the authors Alan Robach and his colleagues in the climate world were roundly criticized for adopting a worst case scenario. If there's a war in South Asia and it goes nuclear, there'll be a bomb or two. It's not going to be 100 bombs. Well, we now know that India and Pakistan each have 130. So there are 260 nuclear weapons potentially in play in South Asia. And many of these are much larger than the Hiroshima bomb. So the scenario that we've considered, 100 Hiroshima bombs, may seriously underestimate the extent of the danger. But that's the one that the data has been generated around. So briefly to summarize this, if there is a war of this sort, in South Asia it is a total disaster. In the first week, 20 million people die from the explosions, the fires, and the direct radiation effects, the short-term radiation effects. But what has really captured our attention is the global climate disruption that follows this. If you drop 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs on 100 modern cities, you put between 5 and 6.5 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, where it stays for decades. And that blocks sunlight. It cools the whole planet. It dries the planet, because when the air is cooler, less water evaporates in the ocean. It shortens the growing season. The presence of all of this carbon in the upper atmosphere superheats the upper atmosphere, which depletes ozone and lets more ultraviolet lights through the surface of the planet. As a result of all of these climate disruptions, there's a big impact, negative, on food production. There's a significant decline in crop production across the world, not just in South Asia. This is a global phenomenon. And as a result of that, there will be, should there be a war of this type, a worldwide famine. And we have estimated that up to 2 billion, with a B, people are at risk of dying in that famine if it takes place. We can't know the exact numbers, but there are 2 billion people whose current food situation indicates that they would be at risk of dying. An event of this magnitude, should it happen, would not be the extinction of the human race, but it would be the end of modern civilization as we know it. No civilization in history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there is no reason to think that the very complex, fragile economic system which we have created, on which all of us depend, would survive this kind of shock. You know, the housing bubble here in the United States put the whole world economy into a tailspin for almost a decade. We're talking about a disruption, orders and orders and orders of magnitude greater. And this civilization is not going to survive if that happens. That's a limited war. That is a war that involves less than 0.5% of the world's nuclear weapons. A war between the United States and Russia is just incredibly much worse. Let me tell you just briefly, start by describing what happens to a city in a modern nuclear attack, because again, I think people have images, but they don't get the full picture. All of us have pictures in our minds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was an important warning about what nuclear weapons can do. But the main thing we need to know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they don't begin to prepare us for modern nuclear warfare. A city like Boston is not going to get hit with one 15-kiloton bomb. It's going to get hit with something like 10 to 15 bombs, each of which are 30 to 50 times more powerful. And to describe that, we use a model of a single 20 megaton explosion. This is an explosion 1,700 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. We actually used to have weapons this big in the US and the Soviet arsenals back in the 80s. We don't anymore. The modern weapons are significantly smaller than that, but the effect of 10 to 15 smaller bombs going off is actually greater than one 20 megaton bomb. So, but let me just use this as a model because it makes it easy to get the picture. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of that bomb, a fire wall forms that reaches out to 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this entire area, everything is vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth disappears. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion generates winds greater than 600 miles per hour and blast pressures greater than 25 pounds per square inch. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that people can build. Underground shelters collapse when they're exposed to overpressures that are this great. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat is so intense that automobiles melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat is still so intense that everything flammable burns. Paper, cloth, gasoline, heating oil, wood, plastic, it just all ignites, and you get hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour coalesce into a firestorm 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature rises to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen is consumed, and every living thing dies. I mean, the bacteria and the viruses die. It is sterilized of life. In a war between the United States and Russia, this kind of destruction would happen on every major city in both countries. And if NATO got dragged into the war, most of the great cities in Canada and Europe as well. All told, we'd be talking probably of 2 to 3 to 400 million people dead in an afternoon. But again, these direct effects are only part of the story. The war in South Asia puts 5 to 6 million tons of soot in the upper atmosphere. A war between the United States and Russia, using just the forces which are currently deployed, puts 150 million tons of soot in the upper atmosphere. And that drops temperatures across the planet about 14 degrees Fahrenheit on average. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures drop 45 to 50 degrees. We have not seen temperatures on this Earth that cold in 18,000 years, since the coldest moment of the last ice age. And what we will essentially do, if we wage this kind of war, is to create a new nuclear ice age that will last for decades. And under those conditions, all the ecosystems which have evolved in the current temperate time period will collapse. Food production across the planet will essentially stop. The vast majority of the human race will starve to death. And it is possible under these conditions that we will become extinct as a species. Now, this is the danger that we face every single day that these weapons exist. We act as though we're safe, but we're not. We know of at least 6 occasions that are in the public record when either Moscow or Washington actively began the process of launching their nuclear arsenals in the mistaken belief that they were under attack from the other side. And on each of these occasions, we were saved at the last minute when the real situation was discovered. We have been incredibly lucky. Robert McNamara, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, said, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. It wasn't just then. It was all these other times as well. And the current policy of the nuclear-armed states to maintain their arsenals into the indefinite future is really nothing more than a hope that our good luck continues. And that's an insane policy. Our luck isn't going to continue indefinitely. Sooner or later it's going to give out. One of these episodes is not going to have a happy ending. And all the horrible things I've been talking about are going to happen. So there's an imperative that we do something about this. And the good news is that we can do something about this. I should take a big breath at this point in my talk. I'm not a pessimistic person, and I'm not an unhappy person. I like my life. I get up in the morning with a smile on my face. I don't think this is what has to happen. This is not the future that has to be. Nuclear weapons, it's not like an asteroid coming at us from outer space that we have no control over. We built these things. We know how to take them apart. We've already dismantled 50,000 of them. And once before, we, ordinary citizens, through public action, fundamentally changed US and Soviet nuclear policy. In the 1980s, we were racing towards nuclear war. There were, at that point, 60,000 warheads in the world. The US and the Soviets were each building 3,000 new warheads a year. We were actively developing plans to wage nuclear war in Europe without any understanding at all of what that was going to do to the planet. And in that setting, millions of people here in the United States, in Europe, even in the Soviet Union, became active. We demanded the policy change, and we won. And it was a victory that was so abrupt that we actually missed it when it took place. When Ronald Reagan took office in January of 1981, he was the most hawkish president with regards to nuclear weapons we have ever had. He was advocating nuclear war fighting as a legitimate tool of US policy. And in January of 1984, he gave a State of the Union speech in which he said nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. And we all thought this was just campaign rhetoric for the '84 election. But it wasn't. We had changed his mind, and we had already changed Gorbachev's mind too. And they went on to come close to abolishing nuclear weapons just 2 years after that in Reykjavik. And they did start set in process the series of treaties which led to the diminution of nuclear arsenals down to their current levels, which was a useful and important thing to do, although it didn't solve the problem fully. But I believe that all of us who were active at that time can honestly say that we were part of a movement that saved the world. And so what we are about today is not something impossible. It's simply doing again what we've already done once. We need to build that kind of movement. And there have been some very important building blocks that have been put in place already. Internationally, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, whose steering committee I have the privilege of sitting, was started by the physicians movement, by IPPNW, 11 years ago in 2007, with a stated goal of securing a treaty to prohibit the possession of nuclear weapons. In 10 years, we achieved that. 122 nations voted for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on July 7th, 2017. The treaty is currently in the ratification process. About, I think it's 14 to 15 countries have ratified so far. When 50 countries ratify the treaty, it enters into effect. And we expect that to happen sometime next year. This has transformed the international debate about nuclear weapons. It is no longer the private chess game of the nuclear-armed states. The non-nuclear states are saying, you're talking about the wrong things. You need to focus on the humanitarian impact. You need to talk about what's going to happen when these weapons are used, and you need to get rid of them. And the nuclear weapon states have not been part of this process, but they are clearly feeling the heat. They have opposed this ferociously and continue to oppose it. They're trying to keep the treaty from entering into force. And it is clearly putting pressure on them. But it's not enough. We need to build pressure within, and especially here in the United States. In the 80s, it was the Soviet Union that really led the way. I do not at this point see in Russia or China or any other country a leader that's going to play the role that Gorbachev played. We may be surprised something may emerge, but we're not seeing anybody yet. There's also nobody clearly identified here in the United States, but the field is much more open here. We're going to have an election in 2 years. We don't know who the nominee is going to be. There's a chance that we can bring to office somebody at that time who does get it like Gorbachev did. And so to try to accomplish that, we had started this campaign called Back from the Brink, a call to prevent nuclear war. It is built around a simple statement of what U.S. nuclear policy ought to be. The core, there are 5 points. The 5th is the most important. It calls on the United States to enter into negotiations with the other 8 nuclear-armed states to establish a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound framework for dismantling the rest of the nuclear warheads. And this is the essential step that needs to be taken. Neither the US nor Russia nor any of the other nuclear weapon states are going to just sign the Treaty on Prohibition individually and give up the nuclear arsenals with the possible exception of the UK. All of them are going to have to do this together. They're going to have to negotiate a very, very difficult agreement to provide the safeguards they all feel are necessary to give up their arsenals. But that's the step we need to take, and that's the core of the Back from the Brink campaign. There are four other interim measures that we propose that the U.S. take immediately as these negotiations proceed. One, that we take our weapons off hair trigger alert so they can't be launched accidentally. Two, that we promise never to use them first, something which we refuse to do and which introduces a nuclear dimension to every crisis. Three, that we end the unchecked authority of the President of the United States to launch nuclear war without anybody else having to give their assent. And four, that we abandon the plan to spend $1.7 trillion over the next decade, over the next 30 years, to enhance every aspect of our nuclear arsenal. So it's a simple 5-point program that we feel is what U.S. nuclear policy ought to be. And what we're trying to do, the strategy is to go around to town meetings, city councils, labor unions, professional associations, church groups, all around the country, and get them to sign on to this statement. And if we get enough people to say this is what U.S. nuclear policy ought to be, we will have effectively created a national consensus that this is what U.S. nuclear policy ought to be. And obviously we're going to need to do more with that consensus to force our leaders to follow through on this. But that's the strategy for right now. And it's modeled very much on the Freeze campaign of the 80s, which had a simple statement that the U.S. and Soviet Union should freeze their arsenals. Took that to the same kinds of audiences and constituencies around the country and created a movement that forced change on the U.S. government that was at the time extremely reluctant to make that change. The campaign has gotten off to I think, really wonderful start. Nationally, we have a steering committee now that has representatives from PSR, the Union of Concerned Scientists, Soka Gakkai International, the Buddhist group, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation on the West Coast, and nationally the UCC, the United Church of Christ. The campaign has also been endorsed by many other faith communities nationally and locally. It was endorsed unanimously in June by the U.S. Conference of Mayors, 30% of whom were Republican, and the vote was unanimous. It was endorsed unanimously by the Baltimore and Los Angeles City Councils in August, and later in August it was endorsed overwhelmingly, although not unanimously, by both houses of the California legislature. And we are now sort of reaching out, trying to replicate those successes all over the place. In Massachusetts, we've gotten 10 municipalities to sign on, as well as a bunch of churches. And the Sierra Club in Massachusetts has signed on. We're in conversation with the National Sierra Club to get them to join, which would be a huge boost. They're a very powerful organization, and they ought to be part of this campaign. And we're trying very hard to make this something which is open to anybody that wants to be involved in it. The groups that I mentioned are currently functioning as a coordinating committee for the campaign. But we don't own this campaign. We're hoping to bring other groups in as quickly as we can. The model is ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which has a steering group that represents 10 of the 500 organizations that are part of the campaign, but tries to be as open and transparent as possible and to involve people's participation as much as possible in formulating strategy. So I think, as I said at the outset, New Hampshire has a potentially very important role to play in this campaign. If we could get a bunch of city councils, a bunch of town meetings here in New Hampshire, if we could get some local faith communities, individual churches, statewide church associations to endorse this, if we could get some labor unions in the state, some professional associations in the state to endorse this, and then if we could get their members to show up at all those town meetings that the candidates have late 2019.
They're here. It's already happening.
I know.
It's not. Don't wait.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying to wait, but the pace pays up. If we could have those meetings filled with people who are saying, by the way, what is your position about the Brink? I think we can get the kind of national attention to this platform that we need to get. And so I talked to actually one I was expecting to, but people look like they were interested in what I was saying, so I kept going. So what I'd really like to do is spend some time talking about what plans we could make here in this part of the state. Are there specific towns or cities where we think we have entree, where we know people, where we could get resolutions passed? Are there faith communities that people belong to who could issue statements that haven't done that yet? The trade union movement would be a really powerful ally to bring into this. It has not historically been part of the peace movement generally, but there are unions which are open to discussing these kinds of broader policy questions. And if people have connections with any of them, that would be a really useful thing to do. So the campaign has a website, preventivewar.org, and there's a page out called Who's on Board, in which you can see a list of all the organizations, the national organizations and then local organizations organized by state who have already signed on.
What's that link again?
PreventNuclearWar.org. Prevent Nuclear War, all one word. The text of the call is there. The text of several of the resolutions that we've passed so far are on the website, so people can use those as models to craft their own local resolutions. And a lot of background information as well. It's a pretty good website, actually. It's work, but it's pretty good.
I just want to add, I'm from the central part of the state, and we have a nuclear weapons working group there, which maybe is part of it. Now that we're having more time on nuclear weapons, yes, we can get back to that and maybe bring some of these issues to the legislature.
You're based where?
Concord.
Concord, okay.
Yeah, our group is part of it's a project of AFSC and New Hampshire Peace Action, but not so much about our group, but at our last meeting we said, we don't know if we have the energy to do town meetings on a vast scale, but we should really, it's time to think about it if we're going to do it. And so I said I would adapt town meeting instructions that was actually put out by the New Hampshire Rebellion a few years ago. And so, you don't have to look at them now, but I have, actually I'll pass them around. They're instructions for how to do a town meeting resolution, and it includes Ira's resolution and also another sample resolution about military spending. So, should I just put them over there? Do you want to see them now?
That's not.
But that's a tool, and we want to talk about it in central New Hampshire also.
Just to say that we did a campaign before the town meeting in Canterbury, New Hampshire last year with the resolution focused on excessive military spending, including spending on the new generation of nuclear weapons. And we organized a little committee, we put on some educational events, we drafted a leaflet, we talked to people, we brought it to the town meeting, and it passed overwhelmingly. So, and then we followed that up with conversations with our two senators, U.S. representatives, saying, hey, did you get this resolution? What are you going to do in response to this? And now that is then providing some grist for further conversations with them. So it's something that could very much, the same type of thing could happen. And the town of London, New Hampshire, 2 Marches ago, also passed a resolution. It wasn't modeled on back from the Brink, but it was very much consistent with the point of back from the Brink and focused on weapons staging.
The back and Brink resolutions and various towns are adapting in different ways, but we're hoping everyone will keep in the resolution of the 5 points. The resolution has a bunch of whereas clauses, and people should feel free to change it if they want to. But the common thread amongst all the resolutions that passed around the country is the 5-point program of what the nuclear policy has to do. And I think an important prefacing part, the last sentence in the whereas clauses is we call on the United States to embrace the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons by doing these 5 things. And we chose the word embrace rather than sign and ratify very deliberately, because we want the conversation to focus on the need for universal nuclear disarmament, not to get hung up on whether the United States should disarm it. And I think it doesn't make a huge amount of difference right now, but as we get, this becomes a real, if we're successful, this becomes a real national debate. Are we going to go with this? If the conversation turns to, should we sign the treaty right now? That's going to be a conversation about unilateral disarmament, and we lose that conversation. It just plays to everybody's wrong instincts. What we need to be focusing on is this multilateral process, which is indeed what we need to have happen. I think that our experience in Western Mass really surprised us. the West Cummington Congregational Church had their congregational meeting. They voted unanimously to back the Brink. It turned out that in the congregation were people from 4 different small towns in western Massachusetts. They all brought up to their town meetings, and they all passed majority unanimous. So there has not been much opposition any place so far. There's just been people's reactions been, oh, wow, it's really that bad, and then wanting to do something about it. So I think opposition will probably build as our success builds, but at the moment, I think it's a relatively easy thing to go out if you can get people's attention. And we used a strategy initially. Well, we did 2 groups. We went to both towns and churches. We thought that those were the 2 easiest kinds of groups to approach because they're both set up to consider questions like this. It's been a little bit harder. We have a question before the American College of Physicians and before the Mass Medical Society, and they will probably pass resolutions at some point as well. We've gone to a few hospitals and asked them as hospitals to take a position. That's been hard because they don't do that. It's not the kind of thing that they're used to doing. But the churches are used to taking positions, and the town meetings and city councils are used to taking positions. Faculty senates, student governments, potential audiences that we can reach out to that are used to offering their opinion on various issues.
Medical societies?
We have approached, a couple of years ago we got a terrific resolution through the American Medical Association calling for the abolition of all nuclear weapons. But we have not gone back to them yet with a back from the Brink resolution. It's in the works, but we're not giving up with that.
How organized is this Physicians for Social Responsibility? There's a group in New Hampshire too, right?
We actually don't have a chapter.
You don't?
No.
We
used to have one in Concord, we used to have one in Hanover, we used to have one here in Portsmouth, I think, back in the 80s, but at the moment we don't have a chapter, we have some activists. PSR is a relatively small organization at this point. It's got maybe 30,000 activists around the whole country. It's not like it was previously. We're obviously hoping that will change. Union of Concerned Scientists is a little bit more organizational heft, but not a huge amount. We're trying in the campaign we don't want to spend time and energy building a bureaucracy. We've not formed a new group. We're not even really calling this a coalition, we're calling it a campaign, which is the terminology that I can use. And we're trying to have all the energy focused on how we get this done, not how we organize ourselves. And we're trying to get the work done to the extent we can through existing networks. So for example, we're very encouraged that the United Church of Christ nationally is getting engaged because we're hoping that they will reach out to their whole network. And we're hoping some of the other denominations will do the same thing. And we're very excited when the Mayor's Conference did, because now we're in conversation with them about going to their next meeting and doing a workshop to get individual mayors to go back to their towns and trying to take advantage of those kinds of existing networks and infrastructures.
I was thinking it'd probably be useful to say a little bit about previous precedents here in New Hampshire, and I guess the most obvious one is you mentioned the Nuclear Freeze campaign. Because you probably worked on it. Do you remember how many towns ended up?
I've lost track of it. The first year we had, in '82, we had a couple dozen, and the next year we had maybe 3 dozen or something like that. But we were also doing it in conjunction with campaigns in Vermont, Maine, and to some extent in Massachusetts. And Vermont was really the leader on that. It was 18 towns in Vermont in 1981 which actually also followed referenda in Western Mass, which was also interesting because that was really the test. It was on the same ballot where people in 3 districts in Western Massachusetts voted for Ronald Reagan for president. By majority, the same voters went and said, we want the United States and the Soviet Union to agree to freeze nuclear weapons. It jumped from there to Vermont town meetings with 3 towns in New Hampshire getting on board at that time, Hanover, Plainfield, and Henniker in 1981. And then the next year we had a much larger group in Vermont and a somewhat correspondingly larger groups in New Hampshire and Maine. And then it was really from that also, from the people who worked on those campaigns in the different areas, that we stitched together what became the New Hampshire Nuclear Freeze campaign, the group that we now know as New Hampshire Peace Action. So it also helped, it not only educated our communities, it not only put people on record and informed our politician that this was actually a majority notion, it also helped us bring an infrastructure for ongoing education and organizing, which is, from my perspective, as important as anything else that we could be doing with this type of campaign.
And there is a campaign going in July. South Burlington became the first community of Vermont to endorse back in the last week. Ben Cohen from Ben & Jerry's is trying to organize a statewide initiative around this with some PSR people in Burlington. There's a very active campaign in Maine where we do have a very strong PSR chapter in Portland. And a bunch of statewide organizations and faith groups in Maine have endorsed already.
So in the Seacoast,
Well, we've been talking about a couple of communities to start with. It's kind of a pilot project, and notably Durham, where we're going to have you speak again, not coincidentally, in Portsmouth. And we already have some support already from the mayor of Portsmouth, which is always a good thing. I don't know, Sandra, do you want to say any more about that?
Well, we're hoping to really maybe go to Durham first as the first place to vote, and maybe get geared up for December for going to the city council here in Portsmouth. And I think we'll be able to do it. Do you have any suggestions about how many people it usually takes going before council to impress them with this?
I mean, I think it depends how sympathetic the council is to begin with. In Northampton, when we decided we wanted to do this, I met with the president of the city council who works in a local restaurant. We had coffee and I talked to him about it. And 3 other people spoke to 3 other councilors, and it was clear they all supported it. And we said, all right, let's just go with this point. And they agreed to introduce it. The way it's set up in Northampton, there's a public comment section at the beginning of each meeting. So, and it has to go through 2 readings in Northampton. So at each of the 2 meetings, we just had a handful of people showed up and spoke for it. But we knew that this was not going to be highly controversial, that they were going to go for it. So I think it depends a little bit on what your read is of the local situation here. I mean, at one level, you'd like to have more people be involved. We kind of regretted almost that it went through so quickly, because it's a good way to do the kind of organizing that you were just talking about, and also to get some publicity for it. And the goal of this isn't just to get a resolution passed. We want that to happen. We want that to happen in as public a way as possible, so that it's in the press, so that people are thinking about it, so that it doesn't seem like it's coming from outer space when somebody stands up at a candidate forum and says, "What do you think about back from the brink?" So people are prepped, they've known about this, they've heard about it. Well, in Massachusetts, most town meetings take place in January, February, and March. Is that the pattern here as well?
March.
In March?
Second week of March, mostly.
March and May.
You said earlier.
It's not a meeting, though, it's just a...
deliberative session.
Yeah.
So that would you have to be ready for that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to file back in December, really.
So, I mean, I think that calendar is something to bear in mind. It'd be terrific if you could get even a dozen or a half dozen towns to pass resolutions altogether at that time in March. But you'd have to identify which towns you think you have the connections and the ability to do it, and make sure it gets on the warrant, and make sure that there's some local people who want it.
Well, we've done that in the last couple of years with other issues, so the basic infrastructure is really there if they buy into the issue. Yeah,
So you're saying Exeter is on board?
would be, absolutely, yeah.
Good.
I've never lost. Everyone I've brought to the town, I've won, so.
Does Exeter do a town meeting or is it a city council?
We do a town meeting, but it's not, it's a Senate Bill 2, so you have to vote on it instead of the regular old-fashioned town meeting.
So, can I ask what's your name?
Herb Moyer,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, we've met, yeah, okay.
Whereas Portsmouth, Durham, Dover, the cities, they could do it any time. So it's not stuck to that schedule, although obviously we'd like to happen all this
But
year.
that'd be nice if a couple of the cities did it like in November, December, so that there's a precedent for the towns to do it then in March.
Yeah, that's what we were thinking, that if we could get some of the towns to do it, or the modified town councils and the cities to do it, that would be a really good precedent.
So when can Durham go? Can Durham be in time? Or?
Yeah, Durham can be any time because it's a,
Town council?
It's a town
Representative
council.
campaigns.
So they have
How
a
often
structure
do
that,
meet? Do you know?
they meet every other week. They meet the first and the second Monday of every month.
Third.
The first and the third, excuse me. And two of the council members have committed to coming to Ira's presentation on October 22nd. So that's a good start.
Wow.
Try to increase it to a few more people before the 22nd.
What about some of the other cities like Concord and Manchester and Nashua?
I would think Manchester would be very unlikely. They just don't have that kind of infrastructure for moving something like this. Nashua has a very progressive mayor who could be approached, and if he decided he liked the idea, he would basically just do it himself. And he could. I mean, he actually, he was out of office for a long time, and he back in the divestment period, he just one day woke up and said, you know what? Hey, we could divest. I'm the mayor. We're doing it. It was not like that. So he could conceivably. But again, if we have the resolution from the U.S. Conference of Mayors and kind of put that before him, it could conceivably get his attention.
Concord too, I would think.
And they were the first city to do Mayors for Peace. I remember because we were doing it in Portsmouth, and we kept wanting to Concord. And it was like 20 years ago. I don't know if you remember that happened, but I presume it was another generation back. But, we have that precedent.
Again, you need to find a couple of basically activists who live in Concord who would champion it, and find a couple of allies on the city council, and then move it through that way. Concord has just adopted a renewable energy platform, fossil-free by 2050 type platform, which there is starting to move forward. And that was a lot of work that went into passing that. So some of the same people might be interested, perhaps.
I'm not remembering his name, but there was a person that was on the New Hampshire Peace Action Board from Nashua, and he was very interested in being very active, and he might be the person that we should call to see if he could start working on something in Nashua.
That is good, yeah. Well, Joni, she lives in Hollis, but again, that would be another town. So we're gonna bring New Hampshire Peace Action is having its annual dinner in 2 weeks, and we're going to have a table there and be really trying to actively promote the idea of doing a town meeting campaign at that event. So again, there's others of you who are going to be there to help us kind of not just sit at the table and wait for people to come talk to us, but to help us get around and get people's attention. That is
October 6th.
October 6th.
October 6th.
You can come.
One's the 6th and one's the 28th.
Where is that?
In Concord. Yeah.
So,
Maybe we could, like, events like that, promote the Durham event as something of a talk and organizing meeting.
Right, absolutely.
Maybe we
The
could.
Durham.
At that
Yeah.
meeting, promote the Durham Public Library event on the 22nd.
Oh, yes, yeah.
As a kind of a combination talk and organizing meeting.
Ira? One of the things that New Hampshire has, and I think Mass has it as well, but we have an organization called the New Hampshire Coalition of Community Media, and they have a video server, and anybody that's a member, and there are a lot of communities that are, can upload a video available for other communities to download for local broadcast to their residents. So that's a potential distribution method, because most of them will put up progressive and other things. It's not a question of would they run it, it's a question of did they find it interesting enough to download to play on their TV system. So I think Mass has a similar thing.
And And then one of the other constituencies that we haven't talked about, that's important, is the press. There are papers in the state that are more progressive, and some that are less. And
The New Hampshire Gazette. We'll get a copy from you.
Yes, the answer is yes.
you know, again, if we're trying to put this in the air so that the candidates have to think about it, talk about it, having some meetings even with editorial boards or with news staff so that the reporters are briefed about it so they understand it, so that maybe they ask some questions too of candidates about this, and understand and know how important this is if somebody else asks a question, so that it's one of the questions and responses that gets reported, that kind of thing.
It is hard. I mean, not that we don't know that, but we bird dogged quite a bit in 2016, and we talked to almost all the candidates. The press, however, and it wasn't just about nuclear weapons, when the press reports candidate forums and candidate town meetings, they're all horse race stories. They almost don't care about the issues.
Yeah.
So,
I understand that problem, yeah.
So it's a challenge.
I did some press work here in 2010. We were trying to get the New Start Treaty approved. And who were you saying you were saying?
Well, our focus then was on Judd Gregg, actually, and we were successful.
Okay.
Our senators this year.
Yeah, it was, but we met, I came up with some other people and that Plowshares organized this, and we met with some of the people at some of the newspapers. And it was useful. I mean, we got a couple of them to editorialize in favor of his voting on the treaty. It takes a little more cultivation, but to try to get them to do editorials during campaign season about.
There's other things. We're going to, as we mentioned before, a couple people from Union of Concerned Scientists are coming up next month. Next week. Judy and I are going to sit down with them. They're kind of the main partner with Physicians for Social Responsibility on this campaign. And they may have, I sort of see the way to approach the media, like the editorial writers, as sort of like how do you influence, in a sense, elite opinion, which is a little bit different than a grassroots campaign. And UCS may be in a good position to help with that type of thing. And that's where you put on forums with scientists and celebrated people, and you do that at the universities, and you schmooze the editorial writers, and you do stuff like that at some point. Again, starting a year ago, leading up to the 2020 primary, and you've got an ability to start to say there's some important issues here that need to get some attention, and at least get some columnists or editorial writers to say something about that. We do have presidential candidates coming through already, and right now, if they're around, it's pretty easy to talk to them. In fact, I'm forgetting her name, the senator from Hawaii was in Keene on Saturday, if I understand it correctly. And the essence of her message to a major progressive group, Rights and Democracy, at their annual member meeting was that progressives need to get serious talking about war and issues of war and peace. Now, her message was not focused on nuclear weapons, but saying that it is a huge problem that our country is so militaristic, and that it's bad for us domestically as well as bad for us internationally. And it's kind of interesting because the group she was talking to is made up of some serious grassroots activists from around the state that might be people who could pick up on something like that from the Brink or other elements of what we're talking about, and start to try to move it both into discussions with candidates, potential candidates, but also at the town meeting level and city council level and things like that. So having some follow-up with Rights and Democracy about that, while also keeping an eye out for all these different candidates. Last Monday, I went to an event with Senator Jeff Merkley, who was speaking to the New Hampshire Council on World Affairs about world affairs issues, and he said, I have 3 issues that are at the top of my agenda. They are nuclear weapons, climate, and human rights, by which he meant immigration policy. So he started out by talking about his long-term concern about nuclear weapons. I thought what he was talking about didn't go as far as I would have hoped it to, but at least it was at the top of his agenda and people heard it, and he's around a lot. And there are others that might be coming around that we can talk to.
He's been, our Oregon our chapter, which is one of our stronger chapters, has been working with him and his staff for a long time, trying to get him to understand stuff. I think he's been quite sympathetic to it from the get-go, but we really did a lot of work trying to educate him. What about Magnus and Ginger? Can they be?
Do you want to say a word?
I would say, I mean, I don't know what meetings you've had with them. Our little Canterbury
Want
group
to turn off
has
his
been
camera or what,
setting
anyway?
No.
Yeah.
Actually, could you?
I'd be happy to.
They have to get a bunch of people who have that position over to our side.
Yes.
And it's even more true, perhaps, when there's this whole cadre of people in Washington who will staff the next administration, most of whom do not have a very good position on nuclear weapons. But they're not like crazy hawks. They're just, they believe in deterrence, and we have to help them all understand how flawed that doctrine is. Part of the problem is they think they know a lot and they don't know a lot about this kind of stuff. That's okay to be like camera. They really don't. They don't know what's going to happen if the weapons are used, and they don't think that the weapons will ever be used. They think deterrence will work. And we need to help them understand how close we've come on how many occasions, and how unstable the situation is. And if we could, the other people that, in some ways, in terms of policymakers, they're the key group that we have to flip and get to understand this issue well. So.
Just don't think that Jean Shaheen's going to be easy because she has a progressive reputation.
She's very strong on arms control. She was extremely good on New Start. She would be very good on that. She's very good on defending the Iran deal, and so is Maggie Hassan for that matter.
She did send on to a letter that Sheldon Whitehouse and Jack Reed and I think Markey and other people wrote to Obama and everybody in the nuclear planning group about the study on nuclear family from limited nuclear war. It was White House that did it.
And she was actually on that panel on the question of presidential authority when the experts came before the Foreign Relations Committee. She was really the only person who asked a question that acknowledged the fact that the use of nuclear weapons was as much of a disaster as it is. And that sort of otherwise didn't come up in the discussion. So she at least was wise and present enough to talk about that. I'm curious whether you have insights from your experience in terms of the... Yeah.
I mean, we get to talk to her sometimes. It's fairly cordial. Sometimes less so, but I mean, we're generally on friendly terms. We cooperate to some extent. Well, she has done a lot in the area of immigration, although we continually ask her to do more. I mean, so it's not,
But this is different, this topic, that's more.
Just to switch gears here, what about faith communities here in New Hampshire? Faith communities.
Unitarian Church in Portsmouth.
And you said UCC was?
Yeah, at this point, the New Hampshire Council of Churches is under progressive leadership. Historically, the Council of Churches has been very good on peace and nuclear issues. They had a number of years where they kind of took a pass on doing anything, but that would be possible. The United Church of Christ New Hampshire Conference would be worth approaching. They have an annual conference that's called Prepared to Serve, which typically takes place the 3rd or 4th Saturday of February, which means that at some point this fall they'll be putting out proposals. And if you've got some like UCC people who might come up for something like that, that might be better than having one of us. We have had workshops on nuclear weapons policy at that conference for the last 2 or 3 years, Judy, I think.
I think it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
But yes.
But we've done that, and we could do that again. There is a Unitarian group called Unitarian Universalist Action which is a statewide group. That wouldn't be too hard to get them to add this to their private agenda in some way.
So this,
Another group that I belong to always does a presentation at Prepared to Serve. And that's the United Church of Christ February meeting.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I agree with you or not. I think they like somebody that has expertise. So I can't imagine that, I would imagine that you would draw a good number of people to the workshop that you would do or something.
If you want to come, that would be, I mean, we could.
yeah, I would be happy to come up with something like
No,
that.
I mean, I think that would be a good place.
And you know, what we've done in Massachusetts, UCC, for example, we are trying to get to their statewide conference, which is complicated because they're merging with Rhode Island or Connecticut or something, and they're all tied with the bureaucratic issues. But we've done a lot of just going to individual congregations on the theory that if like, say, a congressperson gets letters from 4 different congregations saying we all unanimously passed this at a meeting of our congregation, that might even carry more weight than having the state association do it. But these obviously should be complementary. We should try and do both, get the state associations to do it and each individual local congregation that we have any ties with to take a stand.
The action groups connected to the New Hampshire UCC are having a potluck on October 3rd, so that's a week on Wednesday, which I'm inclined to go to. If you could get me even like the name of who like a national contact is at the UCC, it might just be helpful for me.
I'm really embarrassed because he just came to our last round meeting for the first time. I don't remember his name.
But you'll think of it later while you're driving home. It'll occur to you.
Why don't you have your email address? But I don't think you
Yeah, good.
Do people think that it would be helpful if maybe you or somebody you know could prepare what the problem with deterrence is, so that it could be a talking point, points to help us make the presentation to elected officials?
There's been a lot of discussion about all kinds of different, people are talking about writing books about deterrence. I like your idea much better. I think we need some simple talking points about it, because it's really not rocket science. This is just sort of a dumb idea that it's a real emperor has no clothes kind of situation. You know, it would be really good to talk. This is something the Union of Concerned Scientists could probably really do well. It's not a medical question per se. I mean, we could work on it if need be, but we're really trying to focus as much as we can on the medical issue. Right. But when you meet next week with Sean and whoever else is coming up from UCS, maybe you could pose that question to them about putting together something short and simple about what's wrong with deterrence and why. Because in many ways, this is really meant to be an explicit alternative to deterrence. So it probably is very important to address that question directly and clearly.
And if a representative from Seacoast Peace Response wanted, we're having lunch, I think it's Wednesday, in Concord. Think about it. Somebody from your group wanted to come.
One constituency I haven't heard mentioned is the schools and students. We know from Parkland, unfortunately, but we know that students have come to the point where they say we do have a voice and we can be listened to and we should be listened to. I know students, we live in York now. We lived in Hampton for 35 years, but we live in York now. And the students there have started a petition initiative to ban styrofoam. Mm-hmm. And they and others got plastic reusable bags out of the stores, etc. So they are a constituency, I think, that is worth trying to tap into. Because, you know, let's face it, I'm going to be an octogenarian here very shortly, but it's their future. I mean, it could be ours, but it definitely is theirs.
And I think it's a very, very good point. This movement has not done particularly well at all in joining people. ESR has this conversation all the time. We hire people to do social media for us because no one knows how to do social media well. And we're told that that's the only way you can talk to young people. They don't read, they don't watch TV, they don't do anything but do social media. I don't know if that's true, but clearly they do use social media a lot, and we need to figure out how to use that more effectively. There was one problem with young people on this issue, not an insurmountable problem, but something we just need to be cognizant of, and that is they know nothing about nuclear war. And they know nothing about nuclear war. And it is a real issue. When I speak to college audiences, which I do fairly regularly, they're totally able to get it and to understand how important things are, but you're starting really at scratch with them. For almost everybody in this room, I suspect that when I've been talking about this stuff, this is resonating with a lot of stuff that you already know, or certainly knew actively back
Duck
in
and
the
cover.
80s. And you know, just thinking about it a whole lot. For young people, they really don't know about this stuff at all.
Oh, I know.
The famous, I do this experiment when I'm speaking in a classroom. I hand out a piece of paper and ask each of the students to write down how many nuclear weapons they think there are in the world. And the answers always come back between 0 and 100.
Well, but that brings up a point that obviously their education
No, absolutely.
has missed that.
Yeah, this is not their fault. This is they have not been taught stuff that they desperately need to have been taught. But I'm just saying, as we work with students, we have to recognize that they're totally able to understand this. They have wonderful organizing skills and terrific energy, but we need to do a lot of educational work to get them to understand why, with all the other problems that they're trying to deal with, why they need to focus on this too.
I understand. I didn't say it was easy.
But you know, if we have, if people have connections with student groups, absolutely a key constituency to be working with. If we could get the kind of understanding among students that young people had back in the 80s, it would be enormously powerful.
One other thought comes to mind as you were talking and discussing the accident possibility and so forth. The movie, the name I can't remember, but Do You Want to Play a Game? Thermonuclear War?
War games.
War games. I mean, that to me was the message about how potentially close we are.
Yep.
Especially when you were talking about cyber attacks, when that was a very simple high school kid messing around.
I'm smiling because the screenwriter for that movie was mine. I went to high school at this guy, and the screenwriter was my roommate there.
Is that right?
And I've been trying for the last probably 10 years at this point to convince him that he needs to write a sequel that speaks to kids today so that we get the same kind of messaging out. But that movie, I think, is very powerful. And the other one, which I think is really enormously useful still, is The Day After.
Really?
You know, The Day
It's
After.
an anniversary. I remember on NPR, at least, they were talking about, what a big deal it was at the
When it was
time.
shown. It was huge. The live audience for The Day After was over 100 million people. And there was a national conversation about it for weeks before and after, about whether it was appropriate to show something this horrible. And the conclusion was, yes, it is, because it's true, we need to know about it. It had a huge impact on people. And it's still available. I think War Games is too, and they're both worth showing to people.
Yeah.
I was at a conference and they did the BBs being dropped into a metal pan. It was so powerful to just listen to the numbers of BBs dropping in representing nuclear weapons.
Demonstration at all?
Yeah.
Yes.
We do it all the time.
Great. I've almost stopped doing it because I do some of my talks involve flying, and you can't carry the BBs on a plane anymore. But it's a very powerful demonstration.
I lost track of what each BB was supposed to represent, and then some of the nuclear weapons were getting dismantled and more were getting built, and I was just sort of like, okay, I got this big thing of BBs, and anyway.
Still too many.
So I just decided to get rid of it all. But Will at Peace Action has a set of BBs, and I think he knows how many there are.
Maybe Union Concerned Scientists would help with this, but those short video clips, possibly of the phones you were talking about, are just so wildly popular on social media. I put one up of Alabama with the water situation there, with the chemical exposure situation there, and just thousands of people will watch those. And they're very short, they're dynamic, so they're flowing all the time when someone scrolls past it, and they would be very helpful in educating people on it. But I also had another thought about speaking to the legislators in the state of New Hampshire, because there's 400 of them, and they're very closely connected to their towns. And that's how we got many of the cities and towns to sign on to the Paris Accord, or say they were going to. And then the other idea I had was there's a national organization that I'm state director for, which is Will.Want, which is a classic, anti-nuclear women's group of legislators across the country. And we've done things with them here in the state of New Hampshire too, but that would be a great group to sort of bring this.
Will.Want has been focusing primarily on resolutions in state legislatures about presidential authority.
Congressional ones.
But, in California, we had parallel resolutions going, and our back in Brink is very supportive of the Will.Want resolution. They couldn't support the back in Brink. I felt they couldn't or something.
Really?
Yeah, well, because they were focusing on, I'm not sure, it might have been their coalition partner, Global Zero, that couldn't do it. But anyway, they felt no bad about it, and I think it's time to bring it.
Yep.
Well, if you're state
They should commit to this.
I can do it
Are
here.
you still state director?
Yeah.
All right.
It's all nice. We have no legislator anymore. And the question, I had a question, the just seems really difficult to address is, and one of your points addresses it sort of obliquely, is the money and the budgets and just the crazy out of control spending. How can you address that more directly, or how can we get to that? Because that's where all this is happening from, is the budget, that is just out of control.
Well, I have really heretical views about combined budgets compared to many people in the piece, and I'll share them quickly and then talk about what I think you probably want to hear about. I don't think that the money arguments are that important. The $1.7 trillion is something which really infuriates us, who already think these weapons are terrible. But it's $30 billion a year for the next 30 years, about it. And the annual federal budget is $1.5 trillion. And if people are not convinced that we need to get rid of nuclear weapons, if they think that nuclear weapons, that deterrence works, that we need nuclear weapons to defend ourselves, they will happily spend $30 billion a year for that. In Pakistan, they eat grass, in the words of Bhutto when he proposed that they will eat grass if we need to have a nuclear weapon. So I think we need to understand there's no shortcut here. We've got to win the fundamental argument that nuclear weapons do not make us more secure, that they are in fact the greatest threat to our security. And then for those of us who already agree with that, the obscenity of spending all this money on it becomes a further powerful motivator. There are some great tools for getting that part of the message out. The National Priorities Project, based in Northampton, does it every year. They analyze the budget and they break it down, I think, by congressional district. Bob Dodge, who is a terrific PSR activist from Los Angeles, has created a tool that you can use to calculate for your town or any other entity how much your community is spending on nuclear weapons. And it can be very useful information in that regard. The way that Congress may intersect with this decision-making is to either refuse to appropriate money or appropriate money. And I think it's very important that we talk to Congress, but perhaps, reflecting some of the frustration that was being expressed earlier, I don't anticipate that Congress is going to take the lead in this. I think we need to have them on board. I think it's possible for some individual members of Congress to be very powerful champions for this movement and to help us, get attention to it. But I don't see Congress as an institution really taking the leadership on this. And it's sort of like Vietnam, where there's individual senators and Congress members who are huge champions and played a tremendous role in building that movement. But Congress never stopped the war. And on nuclear issues in particular, there tends to be a really inappropriate deference to the executive branch on this when it comes to formulating policy. So I think, long-winded answer, but I think we do want to try to encourage people in Congress not to authorize this money. But the experience we've had now is that even people who are pretty progressive in other ways, until they are convinced that this is a fundamentally wrong strategy, they will appropriate the money. But we can give you all the infrastructure, and that helps to energize us, and that's important too. Well, it sounds like this group has incredibly good, deep connections through all kinds of communities and constituencies here in the state that could be brought into this campaign. And the UCS people who you'll be meeting with do have a staff person based in Maine who is going to be assigned largely to New Hampshire for the next year, who might be a resource that can help people, because it's really helpful sometimes to have a full-time staff person who's got an office and a phone and keep tabs on the bunch of volunteers are trying to get done. So something to talk to Sean about. I know it is their hope that Jake, is his name, will be really able to help out with community organizing here in New Hampshire around this. The people in Maine are busy in Maine, but they would, I'm sure, would be willing to help out if they can.
We got some people from Maine right here.
Yeah.
I was talking about the Maine PSR chapter.
She was talking about people with power.
Maine is the point is Maine is very close to here.
No, I understand.
So we can.
I think it's just over
It's about a
there.
half mile away.
Yeah, I think it's just over there. Of course, there's a half mile of a military-industrial complex, so it's a half mile away too.
And those in Massachusetts and Boston and Western Mass, are used to coming up to New Hampshire every 4 years to do political work, so we'd be happy to help out whenever we can as well.
Yeah, people never realize how early they should come. It really is starting, and after the midterms, it's going to get busy.
So
Come back.
This is an easy trip for me. It's much easier than most of the places I end up going to for IPPNW, which involve 12 or 15-hour flights. So this is real.
Do you have people from Maine that we might be interested in knowing?
The Maine PSR chapter is based in Portland.
Great. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so. That's wonderful.